Someone asked me to comment on Richard Wolff. I decided to give it a try. It was worse than I thought. The video was basically the same talking points as in China's middle school textbooks from the 80s and early 90s. Even China today no longer teaches that childish stuff. You can ask any college kids from China if they still believe the long-term goal of Chinese socialism is to get rid of private ownership of means production. They'll be like, "Are you okay, sir?" But those talking points are still popular in many parts of the world because they were exactly designed for easy digestion to influence those without scientific training. Marx didn't say most of those words himself. They were popularized by former communist countries using unlimited government budgets. And people like Richard Wolff just copied those without changing a word, even though the original authors already moved on. So this video will be a little long, but I think there needs to be a systematic rebuttal of those economic fantasies before we can sit down and figure out how to promote actually useful progressive policy. So here's what Richard Wolff said.
But socialism always meant more than that. Not just a government adding to whatever it is you get out of private enterprise. Not government even regulating private enterprise. So it gives workers a better deal than if the government didn't come in. For example, a minimum wage. Socialism always meant more. And I believe the leaders of China and of other socialist countries are quite aware of what I'm about to tell you. That more remains to be done. We survived the end of the kings. The world didn't come to the end. We will survive the end of the capitalists. The world will not come to an end. And all of us, the working people of the world, as we inherit the ownership and the running of the enterprises where we work, will be the better off for it. We'll grow up to our potential in a way we could not before when we weren't allowed to be our own bosses.
According to this guy and most of his followers, taxing capitalists is not enough. We have to eventually get rid of them. So the key question I want you guys to think about is, who will replace capitalists to provide monetary investment for companies? There are two major schools of thought among Marxists. Some Marxists believe that the investment should solely come from the government, which is basically the Soviet model. That idea is no longer very popular, but I'll address it just to be comprehensive. The more popular version right now is that the investment should partly come from the government, but mostly come from the workers. This idea is even less practical than the Soviet model, but it's more popular because no one tried it before. And the grass is always greener in the imaginary kingdom. No one has seen it, so it must be better than any existing systems. The same psychological trick as the Christian idea of heaven, right? I'm not saying you can't invent new things, but inventions have to be based on logic. And the hardcore system of worker ownership just doesn't work logically. Okay, let me first tackle the Soviet model. Why can't we rely on the government to control all the means of production? The elephant in the room is that if the government controls everything, who controls the government? I don't have to remind you that the government can go wrong, right? How much trust do you have to place in the government to let them control every single firm? But even if the government is always competent, which is a crazy assumption, but even if it's true, how does this competent government set the price and quantity of each product? How can the government possibly know how many socks they should make every year? How many types of socks? How many different colors for each type of socks? If socks aren't tricky enough, how many movies should they make every year? How many actors and directors and makeup artists should they train every year? This is a constant problem in all state-owned economies, from the Soviet Union to East Germany to China under Mao to the present-day North Korea. The supply and demand of products were always disassociated. There was always too little fun and too many nukes. China made 8 movies in the entire 10 years of the Cultural Revolution, because that was exactly the optimal number in the eyes of Chairman Mao. Isn't it telling that you've never seen any hardcore Marxists, including Richard Wolff, talking about that problem? Do you remember any of them making a video about how a communist government chooses prices and quantities? No, because they don't know. Nobody knows. It was all just gut feelings of the Politburo. There is no scientific way of calculating how many types of toy dinosaurs each kid should have. There's only one feasible way to determine prices and quantities and whether to invent new stuff, and that is through decentralized market decisions. If my factory's inventory went up, I'll produce less. If my products are popular, I'll produce more. If people are tired of my old products, I'll invent something new. How else can you do it? Tell me. You can feel free to develop new theories, new models, but Marxism does not address that problem. Even some self-identified socialist countries like China and Vietnam are mostly relying on decentralized economic players. You guys think you have a better idea? Okay, now let's look at the other type of ownership structure Marxists are suggesting. They're like, oh, we don't want the government to control everything. However, we want workers to own the firms. As I said in other videos, I have nothing against worker-owned firms. There are already many worker-owned firms in America. You know Publix? A wildly successful grocery chain in southern states. It's actually worker-owned. The red state version of socialism. However, Marxists are not satisfied with just having some worker-owned firms, because that's already the reality. Too lame. What they want is for all firms to be worker-owned. In other words, they want non-worker-owned firms to be outlawed altogether. If you just think a little deeper, you'll see how ridiculous that idea is. If we ban non-worker-owned shareholders, how does the company raise money? For a labor-intensive business like retail, it may be okay. You may be able to find enough workers to cover the capital investment. But say if your company makes cars or smartphones or large buildings or any projects that require a large sum of investment, where does the money come from? You ask each worker to chip in? How is that even conceivable? Even if the workers manage to find enough money, how much risk do they have to take for their company? If their company fails, their life savings are gone. Imagine when you go to a job interview and the guy is like, if you want to work here, you have to invest $20,000 in the company. What the heck? There's a reason a capital market exists in every functional economy, including China, who calls itself socialist. You need people who can afford to take risks to invest in companies that they don't necessarily work in. Whether through the stock market or investment banks or venture capital, you need a way to channel money to projects. That's going to be true until the end of time. You can't require every investor to be a worker in the company they invest in. And vice versa, you can't require every worker to be an investor of the company they work in. Some people are happy to provide labor and skills without putting their own money on the line. And some people are happy to put their money on the line without having to work for the project full time. You can't force these two groups of people to merge into one. There's no way. Also, do the math. If a person wants to invest in 5 different firms, under the hardcore version of socialism, they will have to take a job in all 5 firms. How is that physically possible? See, all these contradictions are so obvious that you don't need any fancy economic theories to understand them. You just need 5 minutes of quiet thinking. Some people say that mainstream economists don't talk about Marxism because they are in the pocket of capitalists. These people obviously don't understand how the academic job market and the peer review process work, but that'd be another topic. The reason economists don't talk about Marxism is because there's nothing to talk about. The worker ownership idea is just too obviously naive. It's hard to write a fancy academic paper to debate something this obvious. You can't publish in an academic journal if your point can be illustrated in just a few hundred words. Okay, there's no conspiracy here. It's just the nature of academic publishing requires economists to write about complicated, nerdy stuff. Arguments for or against a system of worker ownership are just not nerdy enough for academic publishing because that system is way too unrealistic. Richard Wolff may call himself an economist, but all his recent books are self-published without going through the peer-reviewed process. In essence, he's an influencer. His business model is talking to the public, not the other academics. That's why you don't see other academics debating him. So that job falls on me, a guy who actually enjoys clarifying basic intuitive stuff. I spend a lot of time debating hardcore socialists because their activism makes actual progressive policy much harder to pass. They teach people to be cynical about reforms in taxation and welfare because they only focus on the means of production, like those are some magical infinity stones. They make it easier for Trump to portray the left as crazy communists. And of course, some of them discourage voter turnout by labeling liberal candidates as traitors and sellouts. So guys, ditch those weirdos, please. Worker ownership or state ownership ain't gonna cut it. Having some of those is fine, but making them into a mandatory system that excludes private capital is insane. Come up with something better. Marx is a thing of the past.